Is the Biden administration stuck in Afghanistan? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green. This episode of Right Angle brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, under an agreement struck with the Taliban and the Afghan government during the Trump administration, the U.S. is scheduled to pull its remaining troops out of Afghanistan in May, some 2,500 remaining troops. However, as that is imminent, the New York Times reports that Taliban forces are kind of closing in around cities like Kandahar in Afghanistan, and there's some real concern that they're just biding their time until the U.S. is gone so that they can take control. Now, President Joe Biden is faced with a tough decision. Do you continue to follow through on an agreement that you've already made that says, let's get the U.S. out of there, not just to keep your agreement on an international diplomacy basis, but frankly, the United States has been in Afghanistan for a long, long time, and many in both parties would like to see us out of there. Do you pull out and risk that the Taliban will effectively take over those cities and the government of the nation that we call Afghanistan? Or do you say, no, we're not going to pull out and violate that agreement and therefore inflame the Taliban and basically justify any acts of terror that they would commit against U.S. and NATO forces? Bill Whittle, this is like in most situations in warfare or near warfare, there are no real good answers, especially when you're dealing with the so-called nation of Afghanistan. If you're in President Biden's shoes right now and you're trying to figure out whether to keep the deal that may jeopardize the whole country, or to break the deal and therefore go back into thousands and thousands of U.S. troops in Afghanistan, where do you come down on this? Or at least let me just ask, how do you think this through?
Well, all I can tell you is what I would do if I was president, and I don't know what the details are about the arrangement with Donald Trump's agreement. When I was doing the Cold War special, I wrote that Vietnam was like an 11-year-long toothache that the country had to endure. But Afghanistan's pushing twice that length. Now, in October, we'll have been there for 20 years. We mentioned on the Backstage show something called the sunk cost fallacy. And it is a psychological effect that says that once you start putting money into something, you have a very strong incentive to not continue it because of all of the money that you've already put in there. That's the sunk cost. You've sunk a lot of money into this, a lot of lives, a lot of treasure. And so the temptation is to continue it. If I was the president, I would definitely get U.S. troops out of there in terms of ground troops. On some level, whatever the initial reason for going, well, we all know what the initial reason for going in there was. But if you're going to stick around for an entire generation, because if they had taken infant males when we first arrived, they'd be 20 years old now, 19, 20 years old. If you're going to stay there for an entire generation on the ground fighting these horrible forces, if you have an entire generation to get the Afghan army up to the point where it can defend itself, and that doesn't happen, then you got to start asking yourself if these people are trying hard enough. One of the things that made Vietnam unwinnable under those circumstances, certainly we could have won on the battlefield militarily, but one of the things that most demoralized U.S. troops in Vietnam was just the poor performance, generally speaking, of the ARVN troops of the Army of Republic of Vietnam. The South Vietnamese soldiers didn't fight like their heart was in it. And naturally enough, if you're an American soldier on the ground there, you want to ask yourself, well, what the hell are we doing here then in that case? So if I was president of the United States, I'd do two things. First of all, I'd get U.S. troops out of there. And the second thing I would do is I would maintain a very strong anti-insurgency. Let me rephrase that. Not an anti-insurgency strategy. I would have an anti-terrorism strategy. In other words, I would make sure that the United States still had the ability to fly drones and surveillance and these kind of things. And if we saw a situation that we thought was dangerous to the United States in terms of terrorist camp buildups, we just go in and strike it from the air. That's what I would do. And I really do think that is, when you say the best of both worlds, Scott, you got it exactly right in the question. There are no good choices here. But if it was up to me, that would be the least bad choice. Get the troops out of there and then use our standoff capability and our technology to continue to mow the lawn in terms of terrorists using Afghanistan to just run free as they did before 9/11. and do it without any casualties. America's response in war has always been, we would much rather pay in money than in blood. And I would run that one all the way up to the top of the flagpole.
Stephen Green, Bill is, of course, right in this situation, but in a very real sense, there's the troops motivated to defend Afghanistan, the native people there, don't really think of their nation the way the United States of America thinks of the USA.
That's exactly the problem.
It's essentially, they're not fighting for an idea that's enduring, that's worth defending. In a sense, they're just trying to make sure that the least terrible people are in charge where they are. And frankly, if they don't believe that they have the ability to do that, they'll take the most terrible people and just try to keep their heads down and not get their entire families killed. It's always struck me that the war for Afghanistan, so to speak, has mattered more to us than it does to anybody within the borders on the map that we call Afghanistan. Do you think President Biden, if he seeks counsel from Republicans, will hear anything behind the scenes, not publicly, but behind the scenes? Do you think he'll hear anything useful? And if you were one of those Republicans, what would you tell him?
Well, the establishment Republicans are in on the whole, we have to occupy Afghanistan forever or until it's a happy, fun place, whichever comes last. So I don't think Biden's going to be listening to any of the Trump wing of the Republican Party, clearly. So that strikes me as a non-issue. World War II gave us a bad example. Total victories in war are very, very rare. I can think of two off the top of my head, Germany and Japan in World War II, and I guess the American Civil War, but civil wars don't really count in that sense. Our victories over those two nations were so complete that we changed them for the better. But we also had it kind of easy in a sense. Not that the war wasn't horrible and the fighting awful, which it was, but Germany was, before Hitler, a fully integrated member of Western Europe. It was a modern country. In some ways, it was the most modern country in the world, or at least one of the top three. Japan had been modernizing with a passion since the Meiji Restoration in 1868, I think. They've been trying very hard to become a very modern country, and in some ways they succeeded. In other ways, well, they were imperialistic and awful. Well, I guess that was kind of modern European at the time. So we have these bad examples of these countries that we seem to have transformed completely into liberal Western democracies in 1945 and the years that followed. It's never going to happen in Afghanistan. It just isn't. You know, Scott, you're talking about not thinking of it as a country the way we do. You know, somebody in the United States, somebody from, say, Pennsylvania could move to, say, Texas. And the worst thing that's going to happen to you is they're going to laugh down in Texas at your funny accent. In Afghanistan, you go into the wrong tribal area, which might just be on the other side of a hill, and you're dead meat. This is not a cohesive nation in any sense of the phrase, and it likely never will be. On the national security front, Bill has, on several occasions, likened to fighting terrorism to mowing the lawn. It's just every couple of weeks you got to kill some guys, and it's true. But in another sense, it's a lot like whack-a-mole. Terrorists are very, very opportunistic in where they train. You shut down Afghanistan, they start training in Somalia. You bomb the crap out of Somalia, they move to Syria. And it's just a constant game of whack-a-mole. And we have wasted resources by trying to keep one of the hammers on top of the hole labeled Afghanistan for 20 years now. You can't do this one-handed. We can't. We've poured too much blood and too much treasure just trying to cover this one hole out of many on the board. And we got to get smart. We got to get out of there. We have to keep an intelligence footprint in Afghanistan because that's one of the holes in the whack-a-mole board. Just like we have to have an intelligence presence in Syria and another one in Somalia and who knows where else. But the point is we react slower if we're constantly keeping one of those hammers over the exact same place for 2 decades now. You realize we've probably had soldiers in Afghanistan who were not born on 9/11/2001.
And I think both Steve and Bill are right in various aspects of this. And as I said earlier, there are really no good solutions to this. If I had to guess, I would see President Biden coming down on basically keeping our deal of pulling out the troops, but they're not gone far. They'll be just outside. We have the ability to project power over distance that is unmatched in the history of the world. We have the ability to monitor activity from space. I mean, we have some incredible military capabilities. What we've lacked often in countries like Afghanistan is the boots on the ground intelligence resources. And I'm hoping, if nothing else, we've spent the last 20 years building up good intel networks so that we can be tapped in to what's going on there before it lands on our front porch or knocks down some of our towers in one of our major cities. The whole excuse for going to Afghanistan was to basically crush an area that had been a training ground and a breeding ground for terrorism that was a threat to Western civilization and specifically to the United States. As Steve's pointed out, there's no geographical boundary to that. Afghanistan is a sweet place to set up a terrorist training camp, but they're not the only place to do that. So I would, if I were counseling the president, and by the way, if I were a Republican, I would offer this advice, and I would do it privately, and I would promise the president that I'm not going to try to embarrass him publicly. But I would say, Mr. President, obviously this burden's on your shoulders, but if it were in my hands, I would keep our word according to the treaty, the deal that we made, but be ready. Be standing by. And if I had to guess, that's the way that that President Biden is going to approach this. And I'm just praying along with everybody else that no more American lives are risked trying to save this country that's not a country from the terrorists who've been running it for decades. And frankly, that no more Afghans, the people who live there, the people who do yearn for freedom, the people who do wish that they had a country worth fighting for, that none of them get hurt either. A lot of those folks have helped us over these last 2 decades, and it would be a shame if any negative consequences befell them as a result of their cooperation with people who were coming to fight for freedom. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.